Europe in the late 15th century was a place where kingdoms rose and fell on the edge of steel, where marriages were weapons and bloodlines were currency, and where, behind the heavy stone walls of royal palaces, rulers lived lives the public never truly saw. And on a cold morning in 1474, when Ferdinand V of Castile ascended to power beside Isabella, the world believed it was witnessing the birth of Spain's golden age. It was the dawn of a united kingdom that would shape the fate of Europe and the New World. Yet within the private chambers of this future Catholic monarch, behind the pious image carefully polished for ambassadors and chroniclers, lay a maze of whispered scandals, troubling obsessions, and behavior that even his closest allies described with fear. The man who helped create the foundations of modern Spain carried a shadow far darker than history books comfortably admit. To understand Ferdinand V, also known as Ferdinand Roman II of Aragon, you must step into the world he ruled and the secrets he tried to bury. Ferdinand's story began long before he met Isabella, in the royal courts of Aragon, where indulgence and control fought a silent war. Born in 1452, he was raised in an environment where political power meant mastering deception, where alliances shifted overnight, and where the appearance of holiness was sometimes more important than genuine morality. Chroniclers of the era described him as charismatic, sharp-minded, and capable of reading a room faster than any man alive, but they also hinted at his temper, his fixation with loyalty, and his complicated interests behind closed doors. These parts rarely entered official accounts, but letters from courtiers, ambassadors from Italy, and private correspondence from the Castilian nobility paint a vivid picture of a man whose public righteousness hid private behavior that shocked even his contemporaries. His marriage to Isabella of Castile in 1469 is often portrayed as a romantic political partnership that changed European history forever. But beneath the surface was a relationship far more complex than court poets admitted. Isabella, deeply devout and emotionally restrained, devoted her life to religious reform, stability, and moral discipline. Ferdinand, while a brilliant strategist and commander, was known among nobles for his appetites and his constant need to exert dominance. Their marriage became a battlefield of two personalities, Isabella's purity and Ferdinand's indulgence. Some accounts from the Castilian court later suggested that Isabella endured humiliation not from public scandal, but from private acts Ferdinand carried out with an unsettling sense of entitlement. These accounts were rarely written openly, but appeared in veiled comments by chroniclers, foreign observers, and even clergymen who served close to the monarchs. Ferdinand's behavior was not merely about personal indulgence. It intertwined with politics, power, and control. In many European courts, kings kept mistresses. This was almost expected. But Ferdinand's conduct went far beyond the accepted norms of royal infidelity. What made him infamous in whispers across Spain and Italy was his obsession with secrecy and manipulation. He used spies to monitor women in his own household. He arranged private audiences with young noblewomen under the guise of discussing alliances or finances. Some Italian diplomats wrote home describing Ferdinand as a man whose desires were unrestrained, yet hidden under the mask of a saint. Castilian nobles who opposed his policies sometimes accused him of coercive actions within the palace itself, using language that implied intimidation and exploitation. These were not formal accusations. No one dared challenge the king directly, but the coded nature of their complaints reveals the fear and disgust many felt about his private life. Yet Ferdinand maintained a flawless public image. He supported the Catholic Church, financed religious reforms, and presented himself as a model Christian king. This image reached its peak in 1478, when, with Isabella, he authorized the Spanish Inquisition. To the world, this made him a champion of Catholic purity. but to those in the palace who saw the contradiction between his public devotion and his private behavior, the decision reflected something far more disturbing. The Inquisition gave Ferdinand a tool to police morality, except his own. It allowed him to weaponize righteousness while ignoring the hypocrisy within his own chambers. Some historians suggest that his obsession with controlling the moral lives of his subjects stemmed from an internal conflict he never resolved. Others suggest it was simply another method of consolidating power. By the 1480s, Ferdinand's reputation abroad had taken a strange turn. In Italy, where gossip spread faster than armies marched, stories circulated about the King of Aragon, who presented himself as a holy ruler while living a life that contradicted every rule he imposed. The Pope's ambassadors wrote cautiously worded reports hinting at Ferdinand's disordered passions and habits unsuitable for a monarch of Christian virtue. These reports were sent privately, never intended for the public. They described a man who showed an unusual fixation on control within marriage, behavior that bordered on cruelty, and a pattern of seeking satisfaction not just for pleasure, but as a means of asserting dominance. These whispers never reached official histories, but they survived in letters stored in Vatican archives and diplomatic collections across Europe. The conquest of Granada in 1492 marked Ferdinand's greatest military triumph, but it also marked the height of his personal contradictions. While he rode through the Alhambra as a hero of Christendom, the women of his own court spoke quietly of his temper, his unpredictability, and his increasingly isolating behavior. Isabella, who had become both queen and moral symbol of Spain, was said to be aware of her husband's actions, but endured them in silence for political unity. She focused on governance, reform, and exploration. Ferdinand focused on image, power, and secret indulgence. Their partnership created an empire, but it also concealed a marriage strained by behavior that Isabella's closest ladies in waiting described in terms that revealed discomfort and distress. As Spain expanded across the ocean, Ferdinand's private world grew darker. Correspondence from nobles in Aragon and Castile described his aging years as the period when his obsessions sharpened. He became more controlling, more suspicious, and more prone to chasing distractions that violated the teachings he preached publicly. When Isabella died in 1504, many believed Ferdinand would retreat into solemn widowhood. Instead, his behavior became even more erratic. He pursued young noblewomen half his age, arranged a scandalous remarriage to Germain of Foix, and displayed behavior that embarrassed even his closest allies. Italian chroniclers, known for their bluntness, wrote descriptions of Ferdinand's later years that portrayed a man whose reputation for severity masked a hidden life of disturbing indulgence. Ferdinand V is remembered today as the ruler who unified Spain, funded Columbus, and set Europe on a new course. But the private accounts reveal a man battling impulses he hid behind the iron mask of piety. His contradictions shaped his rule as much as his political brilliance. His private behavior influenced his decisions on marriage alliances, court appointments, and even the severity of his moral legislation. The secrecy surrounding his life speaks to a broader truth. History often remembers kings for their victories, but the shadows they cast behind palace doors tell a different story. And for Ferdinand V, those shadows were darker than Spain ever dared to admit. By the late 15th century, Ferdinand V's reputation in Europe had split into two very different images. In public, he was praised as the sober architect of Spanish unity, the king whose partnership with Isabella would transform the Iberian Peninsula into one of the strongest realms in the Christian world. But behind closed doors, foreign ambassadors and palace insiders whispered about the king's growing unpredictability, a temperament sharpened by the pressures of war, succession, and personal insecurity. As he navigated the complex politics of Castile and Aragon, Ferdinand cultivated a double life, one of absolute religious devotion and another marked by increasingly troubling private behavior that made even seasoned diplomats uneasy. It was during this period that the contradictions in his personality gained the sharpest contrast, exposing habits and desires that clashed violently with the saintly image he projected to the outside world. The year 1480 marked a turning point, not only for Spain, but for Ferdinand personally. While Isabella focused on strengthening legal reforms, cleaning corruption from the courts, and enforcing her moral agenda, Ferdinand took a different route. He had always been controlling, but the pressure of rising power magnified his impulses. He surrounded himself with hand-picked advisors who understood how to maintain silence about his private actions. These men, often rewarded with land and royal favor, ensured that the king's more personal indulgences never spilled into official records. Yet for all their loyalty, they could not erase the reports written by Italian diplomats, who observed Ferdinand's behavior with both fascination and alarm. These ambassadors, trained to interpret subtle gestures and overheard comments, often reported home descriptions of the king that contrasted sharply with his public persona. One Venetian diplomat wrote that Ferdinand exhibited a strange intensity in his private desires, describing the king as a man who sought pleasure not out of affection but out of domination. Another foreign observer commented on the unease among women serving near the queen, noting the careful steps they took to avoid being alone with Ferdinand during nighttime ceremonies or private audiences. These testimonies, though guardedly phrased, suggest a king whose behavior created an undercurrent of fear within the palace walls. Unlike many European monarchs who openly kept mistresses, Ferdinand did not flaunt his actions. His secrecy made the whispers even darker, implying acts that chroniclers could not publicly record but dared to hint at in personal correspondence. Ferdinand's growing power only intensified his private impulses. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition gave him and Isabella a tool that extended into every household of their domains. But unlike Isabella, whose motivations were shaped by religious fervor and genuine belief in moral reform, Ferdinand wielded the Inquisition with an eye toward politics. Some historians argue that his strict enforcement of morality in the public sphere was an attempt to quiet rumors about his own life. Others suggest that his obsession with controlling the moral behavior of his subjects was a projection of his internal struggle, a way to impose order outwardly while failing to impose it upon himself. Whatever the reason, the contrast between his public severity and his private indulgence made him one of the most paradoxical rulers in European history. By 1485, the court of Castile was alive with whispers hidden behind fans and prayer books. Nobles noticed the tension between the king and queen. Isabella, who had given birth to several children and faced the emotional weight of constant political pressure, maintained her dignity and distance. Ferdinand, meanwhile, grew more restless. Letters preserved in the archives of Aragon describe him pursuing the daughters of noble families under pretexts of discussing alliances or inheritance disputes. He would summon them to private meetings where the purpose of the conversation slowly shifted in ways that left the young women distressed and vulnerable. These letters, though coded and careful, allude to a pattern that shocked the families involved. Some complained quietly, but none dared openly challenge the king of a rising empire. The tension within the royal marriage grew thicker with each passing year. Isabella's attention shifted toward the massive reforms shaping Spain's future, while Ferdinand's impulses continued to spiral. There are accounts from the Queen's attendants describing moments when Isabella confronted Ferdinand privately about his behavior, urging him to restrain himself, but these confrontations produced no change. The king, wrapped in his sense of royal entitlement, interpreted morality as something for others to follow, not for himself. This hypocrisy did not go unnoticed by foreign ambassadors. Reports sent to Rome, Naples, Florence, and Venice often mentioned the king's contradictions, describing him as outwardly pious, but privately ruled by desires that bordered on compulsion. Meanwhile, Ferdinand's expanding empire gave him even more opportunities to indulge his obsessions. The conquest of Granada was not just a military victory for him, but also a moral spectacle he used to reinforce his image as a defender of Catholic purity. Yet the same year he marched through the marble halls of the Alhambra as a savior of Spain, palace servants recounted incidents of troubling behavior that contradicted the purity he claimed to uphold. The contrast between the Christian conqueror and the man behind closed doors became so stark that some chroniclers in Italy labeled him the most hypocritical ruler of the age. They did not dare record exact details. Instead, they described a king whose private life was unfit for Christian dignity, a phrase that implied much more than it stated. The years after 1492 brought even more strain. The deaths of several children deeply affected Isabella, pushing her toward greater religious retreat. Ferdinand, however, responded to grief in a different way. Rather than turning inward with remorse or reflection, he sought distractions that increasingly centered around young women brought to court for education, alliances, or service. Some nobles feared sending their daughters to the palace, knowing the king's reputation. Yet refusing royal service was politically dangerous. As a result, families navigated a delicate balance, encouraging their daughters to remain in groups, avoid private chambers, and rely on older ladies, in waiting for protection. These hidden strategies reveal far more about Ferdinand than the polished portraits of him and Isabella displayed in museums suggest. His private behavior began to influence politics in ways historians often overlook. Decisions about court appointments, military promotions, and diplomatic marriages sometimes reflected Ferdinand's personal preferences or attempts to conceal his actions. In several cases, nobles who quietly protested the king's behavior found themselves demoted, exiled, or stripped of influence. This pattern appears repeatedly in letters written by ambassadors who noticed how quickly certain families fell from favor after resisting the king's advances or speaking too openly about his secrets. It became clear that Ferdinand would protect his reputation at any cost, using the machinery of the state to suppress whispers and punish those who threatened his carefully crafted image. By the time Isabella died in 1504, Ferdinand's private world had grown so tangled that even his most loyal advisers struggled to manage the consequences. Without Isabella's presence to temper him, Ferdinand's impulses became more visible. His controversial remarriage to the much younger Germaine of Foix shocked much of Europe. Many saw it as a final attempt to assert control, dominance, and virility in old age. His behavior with Germaine, reported in detail by the Aragonese nobility, pushed the boundaries of what the court considered acceptable. The king, who had preached Catholic morality for decades, now behaved in ways that scandalized even his allies. By the end of his life, Ferdinand had become a study in contradiction. The king who built a moral empire while privately violating the very standards he demanded from his subjects. His legacy, shaped by conquest, political brilliance, and imperial expansion, was deeply entangled with the dark, hidden world he constructed inside his palaces. The two sides of his character collided constantly, shaping not only his own life but the destiny of all Spain. And as the shadows deepened around him in his final years, the mystery of his disturbing private behavior became one of the most unsettling, untold stories in European history. As the 16th century approached, Ferdinand V's contradictions became even sharper and far more dangerous to the stability of Spain. Outwardly, he remained the monarch who had unified the peninsula, strengthened the church, and laid the foundation for an empire stretching across oceans. But inside the private halls of the royal residences, especially in the years after Isabella's influence faded, Ferdinand's behavior became more unpredictable, more obsessive, and more openly controlled by impulses he had once attempted to hide. Without the Queen's moral authority beside him, the king's shadow self stepped forward, and those who lived closest to him began to witness a side of the monarch that historians rarely dare to describe in full. It was in these final decades of his life that the myth of the pious Catholic ruler collided violently with the darker truth whispered throughout Europe. After Isabella's death in 1504, Ferdinand lost not only a political partner, but the only person who had ever been able to restrain him. Isabella was firm without being cruel, devout without being self-righteous, and disciplined in her personal life in ways that Ferdinand never managed to imitate. With her gone, the king attempted to maintain the appearance of control, but the emotional void left behind merged disastrously with his long-standing appetites. He became more temperamental, more possessive, and far less cautious about the secrets he tried so hard to bury when Isabella was alive. The palace staff, who had once relied on the Queen's presence for stability, now found themselves navigating a world governed by Ferdinand's increasingly inconsistent behavior. One of the most alarming consequences of Isabella's death was Ferdinand's renewed pursuit of young noblewomen. Before, he had at least attempted to maintain privacy, relying on layers of intermediaries, coded invitations, or fabricated political consultations to justify private meetings. After 1504, he no longer made the same effort to disguise his intentions. Several ambassadors from Italy, writing home in confidential dispatches, described scenes inside the Aragonese court that left them uneasy. They wrote of the king summoning girls barely in their late teens under the pretense of discussing marriage alliances or family disputes. Yet somehow these conversations always took place away from witnesses, in quiet rooms where the atmosphere changed quickly. These ambassadors, cautious not to insult a powerful monarch, couched their descriptions in vague phrases, but the meaning was unmistakable. The nobility of Aragon and Castile grew increasingly anxious. Some families started refusing court appointments, offering excuses about illness or travel. Others sent older relatives or male guardians to shadow their daughters at all times, turning what should have been ordinary palace service into a defensive maneuver. Yet no one dared confront the king openly. Ferdinand's power, reputation, and sharp mind made opposition dangerous. Those who hesitated or resisted too obviously found themselves suddenly losing influence, land, or political favor. The king wielded punishment with surgical precision, striking only hard enough to silence, never hard enough to spark rebellion. His intelligence, often admired by historians, played a role here. Ferdinand understood fear better than most rulers of his era. He used it not only as a political weapon, but also as a personal shield. The situation worsened when Ferdinand made the sudden decision to remarry in 1505. His chosen bride, Germaine of Foix, was young, vibrant, and barely past adolescence. She was also the niece of the French king, which turned the marriage into an explosive diplomatic gesture. To many observers, the political logic of the match made sense. Ferdinand hoped to produce a male heir who could challenge his son, in Lord Philip the Handsome, for control of Castile. But to those who served inside the palace, the marriage symbolized something far darker. The age gap between Ferdinand and Germaine was so vast that even his own allies whispered uncomfortably about it. Italian ambassadors described the king's behavior toward his new wife as intensely possessive, driven by a need to prove his virility in old age. Reports from the Aragonese nobility depicted a relationship marked by emotional volatility, where Ferdinand swung between obsessive affection and explosive frustration. For Germaine, the marriage became a suffocating descent into a world she had not imagined. Raised in the refined courts of France, she had been taught to expect sophistication, etiquette, and respectful admiration from her husband. Instead, She found herself bound to a man described by her attendants as unpredictable, jealous, and consumed by insecurities. Some letters written by women in her household hint at the Queen's discomfort, describing how she avoided being alone with Ferdinand whenever possible. These letters, carefully phrased and never naming explicit details, reveal a chilling dynamic inside the royal chamber. They describe Germain as isolated, monitored, and expected to conform to the king's increasingly demanding expectations. The court noticed a shift in Ferdinand as well. His temper grew sharper, his need for control intensified. His health, already declining due to age, did nothing to soften his impulses. Instead, the fear of losing strength seemed to fuel an urgency in his private pursuits. Ambassadors wrote of a king determined to prove himself physically and politically, even when his body began to betray him. He insisted on participating in youthful activities, surrounded himself with much younger companions, and refused to acknowledge the limits of age. These actions raised eyebrows even in a time when kings were rarely expected to age gracefully. Meanwhile, the broader political landscape of Spain was collapsing into chaos. Isabella's heir, Queen Joanna, struggled with mental instability. Her husband, Philip the Handsome, sought to seize control of Castile. Factions formed, conspiracies emerged, and nobles positioned themselves for advantage. Ferdinand, more determined than ever to maintain authority, tried to insert himself back into Castilian politics. But while he worked to manipulate court alliances and outmaneuver his son-in-law, his private scandals damaged his credibility. Key nobles who might have supported him hesitated, not because they lacked loyalty, but because Ferdinand's behavior undermined their confidence in his judgment. Foreign observers were even more blunt. Italian chroniclers wrote that Ferdinand was a man attempting to rule an empire while losing control of himself. They described him as consumed by impulses that clouded his decisions, making him vulnerable to manipulation and diplomatic missteps. His enemies exploited these rumors, whispering them across Europe, painting him as a monarch whose private corruption weakened the Spanish crown. Even the Pope's envoys made reference to Ferdinand's excessive passions. In their reports, a carefully chosen phrase that allowed them to communicate moral concerns without directly offending the king. The relationship between Ferdinand and Germain reached another breaking point when she suffered a stillbirth in 1509. The king had desperately hoped for a son to guarantee his legacy and secure the Aragonese succession. The loss devastated him, but rather than processing his grief in silence, he turned his frustration inward in a way that intensified his worst tendencies. His court described daily mood swings, long periods of isolation, and sudden bursts of energy that pushed him toward troubling pursuits. His attempts to control his young wife became even more suffocating, and her attendants reported moments of fear that they were careful to disguise in their letters. In these final years, Ferdinand's legacy became even more conflicted. While he continued to make strategic political moves such as reorganizing Aragon's finances and strengthening ties with Italy, his private chaos overshadowed his accomplishments. Courtiers knew they were witnessing the decline of a king who could have been remembered solely as a brilliant strategist, a unifier, and a founder of empire. Instead, his reputation became clouded by the haunting contrast between the public image he carefully maintained and the private behavior that tore through the walls of his palace like a quiet storm. By 1515, the once mighty king was emotionally exhausted, physically weakened, and spiritually hollowed out by the secrets he carried, and yet he still fought to appear in control. Every gesture, every speech, every public ceremony became an act of performance, masking the turmoil behind his royal facade. The people continued to see Ferdinand as the father of united Spain, but those nearest to him knew the truth. They had lived in the shadows of his contradictions, witnessing the unraveling of a man whose darkest impulses shaped not only his private life, but the destiny of his kingdom. Ferdinand V's final years were marked by an unusual mixture of desperation, secrecy, and a lingering fear that his carefully preserved public image would not survive him. By 1516, the king who had once commanded armies, shaped alliances, and redefined the power map of Europe had become a shadow of the force he once was. Yet even as age tightened its grip around him, Ferdinand refused to relinquish control. His body weakened, but his hunger for dominance, particularly in his private world, clung to him with an intensity that unsettled everyone in his court. Servants noted the king's restless nights, his sudden outbursts, his growing paranoia. He felt the end approaching, and the approaching shadow made his contradictions sharper than ever. One event in particular exposed the fragile state of his mind. In 1514, 2 years before his death, Ferdinand began taking an herbal mixture crafted by a local apothecary, a concoction intended to restore his vitality. Historians later concluded that this mixture likely contained substances that heightened his heart rate, spiked his nervous system, and worsened his mood swings. The king took it faithfully, believing it would reignite the vigor of his youth. Instead, it accelerated his decline, amplifying his deepest insecurities and pushing him into emotional territory that frightened even his most loyal attendants. The result was a series of disturbing incidents so alarming that some chroniclers initially refused to record them, fearing the consequences of documenting a king's humiliating deterioration. Ferdinand's marriage to Germaine of Foix, already strained by age difference, trauma, and Ferdinand's volatility, entered its darkest phase. The young queen, still in her 20s, had grown increasingly cautious around her husband. Her attendants carefully controlled access to her private chambers. The marriage, rooted in political calculation, had long ceased to serve its intended purpose. With no surviving heir, Ferdinand saw his political dreams collapsing. His son-in-law, the Foreign, born Philip the Handsome, had died years earlier, leaving the Habsburg legacy tangled in madness and uncertainty through Queen Joanna. Ferdinand feared that Spain would fall into foreign hands. And as his political world slipped away, he clutched even more desperately at private control, trying to assert dominance over the only sphere he felt remained within his reach. Foreign ambassadors documented these last years with a tone that mixed pity and revulsion. The Venetian envoy wrote that the king seemed driven by impulses no longer checked by reason. Another Italian chronicler observed that Ferdinand lived as though every hour might be his last, and therefore no restraint governed his desires. These words, carefully chosen, implied a world behind palace walls filled with forced affection, sudden emotional demands, and behavior increasingly inappropriate for a monarch who claimed to defend Christian virtue. As Ferdinand's physical health weakened, his emotional grip loosened, and the tension inside the palace intensified. Servants worked quietly, speaking in whispers and avoiding the king's gaze whenever possible. Women of the court became more vigilant, avoiding isolated corridors, always moving in pairs, creating a silent system of self-protection that revealed far more than written records ever dared to state. Meanwhile, outside the palace, Spain was transforming. The New World, discovered under Ferdinand and Isabella's patronage, was rapidly becoming a source of wealth and violence. Conquistadors returned with gold, stories, and ambition. Navies expanded, trade routes multiplied. The world saw Spain as the rising superpower of Europe. Yet inside the royal household, the man who had ignited this imperial trajectory was deteriorating. His closest advisors struggled to maintain political continuity while shielding the kingdom from the consequences of Ferdinand's private decline. They issued decrees for him, wrote letters in his name, and organized public events designed to hide how frail the king had become. But secrecy could not conceal everything. Rumors began spreading through Aragon and Castile that the king was no longer capable of leadership, his mind drifting, his behavior erratic. these whispers reached foreign courts. In France, they were used as justification to challenge Spanish influence. In Rome, they sparked concern about the stability of Catholic power in Iberia. In Italy, they fueled gossip that blended truth and scandal until the line between the two became impossible to separate. Some described Ferdinand as a tragic figure haunted by the ghosts of his political decisions. Others painted him as a tyrant who had lost control of the impulses that had shaped his private life for decades. Neither image was fully accurate, yet both contained fragments of the truth. On January 23, 1516, at the age of 63, Ferdinand V died in Madrigalejos. The official narrative claimed the king passed peacefully, surrounded by prayer and devoted attendants. But documents written by his physicians and preserved in private collections tell a different story. His final days were marked by physical agony, emotional confusion, and a desperate fear that his secrets would outlive him. Some attendants wrote that he begged for reassurance that his sins would be forgotten. Others mentioned his sudden bursts of anxiety, his insistence on controlling even the smallest tasks, as if terrified that letting go of power meant allowing history itself to judge him. In the aftermath, Spain plunged into a complicated transition. Queen Joanna, mentally unstable and controlled by courtiers, could not rule. Her son, the future Emperor Charles V, was raised abroad and unfamiliar with Spanish politics. The kingdom Ferdinand had spent his life building was left vulnerable, unsteady, and uncertain. While Spain would eventually rise to even greater heights under Charles, the turbulence caused by Ferdinand's late life behavior left a mark on the monarchy that historians still trace centuries later. As the decades passed, chroniclers wrote carefully sanitized versions of Ferdinand's life. They praised his military genius, his political strategy, and his role in shaping Spain. They documented his reforms, alliances, and victories. They highlighted his partnership with Isabella as one of the great royal unions of history, but they also made deliberate choices about what to omit. The darker aspects of his private life were suppressed to protect the dignity of the crown, the church, and the emerging Spanish Empire. The letters written by ambassadors, the fearful notes penned by noble families, and the scattered accounts from women of the court all remained carefully hidden in archives rather than placed on public display. Centuries later, when historians began sifting through private correspondence, diplomatic reports, and ecclesiastical documents, a more troubling picture emerged. Ferdinand V was not simply a flawed king or a man who indulged in common royal vices. He was a ruler whose private life contradicted everything he preached. A monarch whose desire for control, dominance, and gratification shaped his decisions in ways that affected the entire kingdom. These newly uncovered details revealed how deeply intertwined his impulses were with the political and social fabric of early modern Spain. Today, Ferdinand V stands as one of history's greatest paradoxes. He built the foundation of the Spanish Empire, yet introduced moral hypocrisy that stained the monarchy. He defended Catholic identity publicly while violating it privately. He expanded Spain's influence across the world, yet failed to control the small, hidden world inside his own palace. His brilliance created an empire, but his darkness haunted his legacy, and it is this contradiction that makes him one of the most unsettling figures in European history. The king who helped shape a nation also left behind a mystery: how a man capable of such political strategic greatness could be driven by personal impulses so destructive, so disturbing, and so deeply at odds with the image he forced upon the world.